Good morning, friends. Let me welcome you to the second lecture of mine. We are reading together Sam Sullivan's 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners. If you remember, in my last class, that is the first lecture on Lonely Londoner, I had given you a thumbnail sketch of Samuel Dixon Sullivan, the writer. Now, in the same way, I would like to give you an introduction to this particular novel. But before I do that, I need to stress certain other facts associated with the life of Sam Sullivan that will be important for your understanding of this particular novel. Now, as I told you yesterday, Sam Sullivan was born to East Indian parents in 1923, after the First World War. And he died in 1994, after a longish spell. Now, he was the sixth of 7 children born to his parents. He started working as a wireless operator. He was in the Royal Navy Reserves. He started working there when he was just 15. Now, he was born in San Fernando. Later on, he actually first migrated to Port of Spain. Now, Trinidad and Jamaica, these were British colonies. Trinidad was at one time a Spanish colony. And that is why you just look at this word, this place names. San Fernando. Spain was a Catholic country. So Saint Fernando. So similarly, you will see that Port of Spain was a capital city. Now, he was for a time a newspaper man. I told you, he worked for the Trinidad Guardian in the 1940s. Now, 20 years after writing The Lonely Londoners in 1956, that means 20 years after that, that means in 1976, he co-wrote Pressure, a movie script, about almost the same subject, It's about a boy born to Trinidadian parents, And if you remember, the second book of this trilogy, starting with The Lonely Londoners, was published in 1975, Moses Ascending, and in 1983, Moses Migrating. So, and another thing, in 1970, he had migrated to Canada. Obviously, after writing this novel in 1956. So he was a cosmopolitan man, in his sensibilities, in his experiences. He had stayed in different places. First, a British colony, Trinidad, then in the metropolitan center, London, and then again in Canada, another of the British colonies, but in a different way. The status of Canada as a British colony and the status of Trinidad as a British colony cannot be equated, cannot be the same. You have to understand these things. Now, in his life, Sam Sullivan has written 13 books and 2 collection of plays. He was a poet, a short story writer, a screenplay writer, a novelist, a playwright, and so on and so forth. In a way, he was also a culture icon. Now, one thing we have to understand, as Shondipon had asked me to explain yesterday, if you remember, the hostility of London to this migrant population was occasioned by an inherent racism that was practiced and even preached. Now, this is something we have to understand. If you read Philip Larkin's poems, and I think I taught you Philip Larkin's poems, if you remember, did I not?
Yes, sir.
So, if you remember, in the 1950s, Philip Larkin, a traditional British poet, a white British poet, was crying foul over the immigration policy. He was considering, in Going, this poem, he was considering, this is important. And the reason why I am using the continuous tense in talking about the understanding and the ideology of Philip Larkin in the 1950s is because it was an ongoing process. Philip Larkin was apprehensive that the United Kingdom may become the first slum of Europe. Why? This is something that I need to talk about before I actually plunge into the text, The Lonely Londoners. Now, if there is a war, if there is a battle, you think about the First or the Second World War, for example. Now, why do you need able-bodied workers, able-bodied human beings? Yes, the first answer will be to fight for a nation. Yes or no? To fight as a soldier. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. But is there no other reason for wishing to have able-bodied human beings? Is fighting the only task for an able-bodied human being of a particular nation during the war? No. There are other reasons. There is at least one other very important purpose that the able-bodied human beings can contribute to. And what is that? You know, there are other efforts required to propel the war effort. You have to make the weapons, the weaponry, arms and ammunitions. You have to make the machinery, the cannons, the guns, the vehicles, the missiles, the bombs, and so on and so forth. And you know, West Indians were big fellows because in their stock there was a mixed blood. Caribbeans, Africans, Europeans. They were big fellows. Many of them had been brought, their ancestors may have been brought from Africa. So they were big fellows. physically very strong. And during the Second World War, many of them had come to the United Kingdom from the West Indies in order to work as soldiers or in the manufacturing industries to manufacture guns and ammunition. You have to understand this. And this actually explains away the arrival of the first generation West Indians to England. Another very important thing happened in 1948 after the Second World War. I had told you that there was this citizenship policy, a national plan of 1948, as per which people born in the United Kingdom or in the British colonies were given unrestrained entry into the United Kingdom, and they were offered citizenship. And the West Indians thought that since economic opportunities were far, far better in the metropolitan center of London than in the West Indies, so they migrated almost overnight. Many of them did. Now, these are the two reasons for the large-scale arrival of the West Indians into England. You have to remember this. Now, I have already told you about racism. There was racism. So even though they came, even though they had much to offer, Abdul Razzaq Gurnah, the Zanjibari British novelist who has received the Nobel Prize for Literature this year, in one of his interviews has pointedly said that we came here not to beg for alms. We had our own gifts to offer. It's not that we always came with a begging bowl. We were professionals, we had our expertise, and we hoped to contribute to the wealth of the British nation. These are things that we have to remember. Okay. Now, as Sondipan and even Bikram had asked me to point out during my previous lecture, you know, there was an element of hostility in the way the immigrants were actually accepted or tolerated. Now, a few other authors and a few other books should be mentioned in this context. If you remember, I have referred to people like George Lemming, people like Jean Rhys, people like V.S. Naipaul, for example. But someone that I have not pointed out or mentioned in my last class was Frantz Fanon. Fanon in 1952 had published a very seminal text black skin, white mask. It actually analyzes the effect of the racial, the social effect on the incoming men and how they could be accommodated. So it was difficult. And that's why he actually points out the blackness of the skin and the whiteness of the mask. So the root was black, the root was outsider. But the pose, the make believe was inside us. So it was a mask that they had adopted. And here I must actually refer to Creole, Creolization, and the Creole language. As I have already told you that from the 17th century onwards till the, say, 19th century, there was a great deal of settlement activities going on in places such as the West Indies. It led to the birth of many children out of the miscegenation between the Europeans and the West Indians. And it also led to the birth of a mixed language that was also called Creole. So Creole refers to not only a particular people, a mixed people, but also their language. In 1954, another related book was published. I have referred to George Lemming. George Lemming in 1954 wrote the novel The Immigrants. It also talks about the life that the West Indian incomer actually expects and requires is not what the employers, the relatives, the well-wishers would have it. So you will see that between expectation and reality, there was a large gulf. Now, Frantz Fanon's book actually refers to two things. Number one, the sexual impact of the period of colonization. And number two, the how do I explain it? It was all about, along with the racial aspect, there was an economic aspect also to this immigration. The outsiders were given ill-paid jobs. So there is always a tenuous element in their stay in England. The sexual aspect of this encounter between the colonizer and the colonized or even the erstwhile colonizers and the erstwhile colonized, is something that needs to be discussed as well. And that's why in 1966 there was a very, very important, almost a cult book written by their time very aged Dominican writer Jean Reeves, about whom I have also spoken in my last lecture. In 1966, she actually published The White Sargasso Sea. So this is something that you need to understand. Is there anyone amongst you who has seen the Hindi film Aa Ab Laut Chale? Is there
Yes,
anyone
sir.
who has seen it? Most probably Aishwarya Rai was there. Rajesh Khanna was there.
Yes, sir.
Om,
We watched it.
yes. So if you have seen it, if you have watched it, you know that there is always an element of tenuousness, instability, vulnerability in the life of the immigrants, whom the host land tries to keep at arm's length. Are you getting my point? Can you understand this? Can you follow?
Yes, sir.
So these are things that you need to understand. Well, do you have the text? The
Yes, sir.
soft copy is very easily available. Have you that?
Yes, sir. We have.
The soft copy?
Yes, sir. PDF.
That's a PDF version. It's a very, very tiny, weeny volume. It's not large. It's not a tome. So some of you may grasp it. You may grasp it. You grab it and read it. Now, this novel is very episodic in nature because it actually sketches characters and describes incidents in the lives of these outsiders in London. Okay. Now, this is a specimen of what is called migrant literature. Because these are actually produced by migrant writers, diasporic writers, and they deal with the issues that are important in the lives of the immigrants. Are you getting my point? And that's why there is an element of fragmentation in this. There is no very clear-cut plot line or progression of plot. They meet, they are alone, but even in their meetings, there is an element of vulnerability, instability, transience, transitoriness, and so on and so on. As a result, it's a fragmented narrative. It's an episodic narrative. And that's why there are no clear-cut climax in the narrative. In a way, the climactic passages occur in this particular narrative when the, okay, let's call them non-British residents try to assert their civic rights and try to feedback at the racially deluded supremacist forces. Have you understood?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, from next day, I will try to give you the understanding of the plot, and then I will discuss important issues. Okay. Now, before I sign off, I would like to invite comments and questions from anyone or all of you.
Sir, can I ask a question?
Please do.
Sir, does the pattern of Caribbean migration have any connection with El Dorado meat? El Dorado meat?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sir, of course. The pattern of Caribbean migration have any connection with El Dorado meat?
Now, connecting it to the El Dorado myth is a bit far-fetched. You know, El Dorado, is about the imaginary place where there is a lot of gold. So in a way, it's a place for wish fulfillment, unbounded opportunities. But then any kind of migration has always this element of optimism. When Sandipan, where from are you coming? Where are you from?
From Manikchok, sir.
Manikchok. When you come to Malda from Manikchok, you think that if I go to Malda, I will get a better place. I will have better opportunities. If you go from Malda to, say, Kolkata, you will think, I will get a better chance of doing fabulously well. If you go from, say, Kolkata to Delhi, again, your expectations will rise. Yes or no? Are you getting my point?
Yes, sir.
So the West Indies was the colonial periphery, the margin. And London was considered to be the metropolitan center. Yes or no?
Yes,
So
sir.
any move from the West Indies to the United Kingdom was always to be motivated by a hope, an expectation, an optimism of better things, higher things, bigger things. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
But to equate it with El Dorado is something that is stretching the point a bit too far. Are you getting my point?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other question?
Sir, I have one.
Yes. Go ahead.
On what grounds? On what grounds does the English treatment of the West Indies differ from the English or Western treatment of the East? Is it only the slave thing, or there are more reasons?
Now, in a way, when you talk about the treatment of the West Indians by the Europeans, it is almost the same thing as it is in the case of other colonial people, from, say, Africa or from Asia. Are you getting my point? They are almost the same because there is the inherent racist element in even the British diplomacy. There is always this thing. So slavery is a remembered historical fact that cannot be wished away. But when any person or persons or community migrate from one place to another in search of greener pastures, there is, if not always, almost always, an element of coldness in the reception that they get from the host land. Because the original inhabitants of that host land considered these outsiders, these incomers, these foreign or degraded human beings from other cultures as a drag on the national wealth and opportunities. So they resent, they oppose, they are none too happy with the arrival of the outsiders. But then there are certain differences. Think about it. There are certain communities that are comparatively better off. And there are certain communities that are comparatively worse off. Why? There are many factors. Number one, the financial aspect of it. Number two, the social aspects of it. Number three, the educational and cultural aspect of it. If you think about the Indian diaspora, you will see in many cases they are treated better. Why? Because they are in many cases the professionals. You cannot say the same thing about the Bangladeshis. So menial labor is exported. And their wages may be received from those proverbial greener pastures. Understood?
Yes.
Any other question, please?
Yes, sir. Sir, Creole is not something particular, it's mixed. So, what could be the objective behind using the Creolized voice for the language of the narration? Is it in order to reinvent the
Now,
London to receive
no,
the
no,
spaces?
no. You have to understand. Actually, when Sam Sullivan started writing this, he was writing it in a simple, straightforward Queen's English or King's English. But then he saw that most of the characters of this novel were basically West Indian immigrants. Yes or no?
Yes,
So
sir.
in order to describe them and their lives and their situations in a more adequate manner, it was better to reproduce the authentic speech that they use, the nuanced vernacular of this Creole. The Creole speech is used therefore in order to lend authenticity to Selvan's portrayal of these men. Because you have to understand a very simple thing. Now, Sam Selvan was also a Londoner by that time, because he had migrated to London in 1950, and this was being written in 1955-56. He was there, but he was a clerk in the Indian embassy. So in a way, he was not as wretched in his prospects as were his less fortunate compatriots or countrymen. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Any other question?
Sir, even there are deliberate grammatical mistakes in the text. We saw that.
Because grammatical mistakes. Now, this is a very dicey thing to say. When you actually speak Bengali, does anyone actually find faults with your grammar?
No, sir.
Not often. When a British man or woman, an Englishman or a woman speaks English, he or she cares a damn, cares a fig, couldn't care less for the grammatical exactitude of the speech. What they actually aim at, on the contrary, is to speak idiomatic English, just as we speak idiomatic Bengali. And that's why when a non-Bengali actually speaks very good Bengali, you will see that there is a difference between the non-Bengali speaker speaking Bengali and the Bengali speaker speaking Bengali, because the Bengali native speaker speaking Bengali is more casual and spontaneous, whereas the outsider, the learner, the second language learner, and the speaker of Bengali, a non-Bengali speaker of Bengali, he is more, we call it, circumspect, exact, and conscious, and cautious, while using his turn of phrasing, his vocabulary, his sentence construction or syntax, and so on and so forth. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other question? Any other question? If there are no other questions, you may disconnect me, But before you do that, I would like to point out this. And before this, Shubham Kita may stop recording.